Hello and welcome to the 23rd edition of Exploring Enterprise, the podcast series from the Enterprise Research Centre. I'm Professor Mark Hart, Deputy Director of the ERC, and today I'm joined by Zofia Bajorek, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Employment Studies, by Petra Wilton, who is Director of Policy and External Affairs at the Chartered Management Institute, and my colleague in the ERC, Maria Wishart, who is a Research Fellow with us. Today, we're going to be looking at an often underappreciated group of individuals, namely line managers, considering their changing role and their contribution to workplace well-being and business performance. It's something I didn't think that I'd be talking about as part of my general view of the landscape of how we improve the leadership and management capacity of our small businesses. But there's one author who has joined us today, who's written a book on the subject. So, Zofia, I'm going to come to you first. I love the title, How to Be the Line Manager You Never Had. I presume that sort of talks of personal experience somewhere down the line, but maybe not. So, right, straight to it. What do we mean by line managers? Over to you, please.
So you're straight in there with a question, actually, that sounds really easy to answer, but in fact can actually be really difficult to answer. And I suppose that confusion leads to the issue about what is a line manager, who are they, what do they do, what is the role that they have. And so I didn't use ChatGPT for this, unsurprisingly. I went to a number of dictionary definitions of line managers. And I suppose there were a range of definitions, but similar themes. And so I'll sum it up as a line manager is somebody who bridges the gap between a senior managerial level and frontline employees. They can be a person in an organisation that focuses on, I suppose, day-to-day operational and execution of tasks, translating those high-level goals or values into concrete actions that employees in the frontline do. But the definition is difficult. It can vary or change depending on organisational structures, size, an organisation's purpose, which means that a line manager can and will mean different things to different people. But I've also heard line managers defined as a linchpin between HR and the front line. They've been defined as key applicators of organisational policies or practices, a vital role for organisational productivity and well-being, a heartbeat of organisations. So it's actually really difficult to pinpoint an exact definition, but it also highlights, I suppose, the difficulty of the role in reality and why organisations might find it difficult to delineate between a good manager or a bad manager, who should be a line manager. I suppose, finally, for those familiar with my work, I often define line managers as the squeezed middle, a position that has to fulfill a range of duties and a range of responsibilities. So that person between HR, between senior managers, between project clients, between direct reports, often having to stretch themselves to be everything to everyone, a position that people might or might not want to have.
Okay, well, why did you get into this particular area in the first place? I'm intrigued.
Two reasons, really. I suppose the first one is I often found myself reading from things about line managers or going to conferences about line managers, and they were getting an awful lot of flack, especially when things don't go right. So productivity is down, line manager's fault. Well-being is compromised in an organisation, line manager's fault. Retention issues, the great resignation, the great detachment, line managers are to blame, etc. and etc. And I'm not saying that line managers don't have a role in some of this. They do, but they are not the sole responsibility of some of these issues. Okay. And so you hear this narrative and you think there are many organisational issues and people with responsibilities in organisations, yet these things tend to fall on the shoulders of the line manager. So I suppose I took an interest in this role, one, because it is definitionally difficult to describe, but two, I wanted to get a deeper dive into actually what is happening in organisations. How are line managers developed, promoted, chosen? What is the what is that slide between what was HR responsibility and now seemingly line manager responsibility? And so if they do have this crucial role, if they are the heartbeat or the linchpin, what can organizations do to make sure that the role is done well?
Okay. Would another term be middle management? Would you accept that or not?
It could be, but middle managers could have a different responsibility depending on the layers and the structure of an organization, which obviously is changing in the world now. But yeah, it could be they could be seen as a supervisor as well. Some of them are known as team managers, which I wouldn't say is the same as a line manager, or a departmental manager, which once again I wouldn't say is a line manager. But because there are these differences in definitions, it actually makes the description and what a line manager is responsible for really difficult.
Okay, before I move on to our other guests today, I want to ask a question. I spend a lot of time with small business owners, founders of businesses, and one of their major problems and challenges they face is actually being the founder, the CEO of the business, and also being a line manager. How would you react to that sort of perspective?
Yeah, it's difficult because what are you trying to do? What is your role? What is your responsibility? Is your role or responsibility that overriding strategic development and that strategic operational overview of what an organization does? Or is it the looking after your staff on a day-to-day basis? And I suppose for SMEs, that line management role becomes even more blurred and even more difficult to differentiate. And you could argue actually that everybody in an organization has responsibility for the well-being of everyone and the responsibility to making sure that people are stepping up to their organizational goals and responsibilities, performing well. But I suppose line managers have that, I suppose, all that employment relationship, that space where somebody knows that they can turn to that one individual to know that they would be listened to be reassured, to be given that development and learning and mentorship that they need. And I suppose that's special employment relationship between a line manager and an individual is what makes the line management role, I suppose, unique in a way.
Okay, thanks for that, Zofia. Petra, I'm going to come to you now because you're sitting there at Chartered Management Institute. The importance of your organization and actually upskilling, if you like, the management cadre in the UK economy. Does this resonate with some of your experience? Is this something that, this is an important group of managers who you cater for within the CMI?
Absolutely. It really resonates with us at the CMI. As the professional body for management and leadership, we have occupational standards that recognises management and leadership skills all the way through. So from that first line management role when people step up and take responsibility for others, so they're managing staff, through to the business owner, the founder, the strategic leaders of an organisation. And it is a professional management set of competencies which is about, at the really heart, it's about managing self. So all those responsibilities about making decisions, being personally effective, to managing others. So it's about those interpersonal relationships, about how you manage your team, how you manage your wider networks, to managing organisational performance. And the extent of those responsibilities do vary all the way through the organisation, depending on where that management role sits, you named a lot of those different titles from departmental manager through to the senior leaders. And that is a set of competencies which can be developed and acquired and also, throughout the careers, progress through. So you're developing those competencies all the way through. What we do see sort of for the UK, there's looking at occupational definitions, there's 8.4 million people as recognised as managers in the UK working population. And we do have a real problem with that definition in that lots of people take on those responsibilities of line management and have had no formal training in what they're doing. And that's 82%, which is a huge percentage of those 8.4 million managers. So they've had no proper training and they take on these responsibilities, which is why often, a lot of those negative comments that we heard about, call it permafrost, call it marzipan layer, rather than the heartbeat or the linchpin. You've got the really positive when they're doing well and supported, to having unfortunately a negative impact if they haven't had the support and development that they need.
So I know a lot of the initiatives and programs that you run as part of CMI, Petra, but is there anything specific you do for this cadre of line managers, as we've begun to tease out a definition? Is it generic management competencies, or is it something specific, or is it, the first time line manager? Is that the sort of thing that you might be getting involved in as a program?
Yep, very much so. What we do is, as I say, we develop the standards, and then they're actually delivered through a whole partner network, be it FE colleges, private training providers, HE, so across the whole landscape. So there are then short courses through to apprenticeships, and they start at the very basic level, at a level 2 qualification, which is that sort of first level, which might be just how to work in a team. So that taking responsibilities for others, then through to team leader, operations manager, through to strategic leader. So, the courses, the development, which can be formal qualifications or it can be a short course. There's a whole lot of different development opportunities that are there and programs out there which are supported through to recognition. And that's part of what we're pushing for, is to actually recognise those little bite-sized chunks all the way through, that the people can then get on the pathway to becoming a chartered professional and have a set of professional competencies which are more widely recognised.
Well, going back to the point I posed to Zofia in terms of the small business population, small business founder manager, the owner manager, if we can call them like that. I mean, how much demand do you think your courses have through the whole partnership network by the SME population, that the 20 employee, the 10 employee business? Can you share us a little bit of information about that, please, Petra?
I think there's probably what we call a latent demand there. I think when people come across sort of good programs or talking amongst their networks, they understand that they haven't had the development that can actually really help benefit. There's one of the positive examples that's been out there, particularly aimed at the small businesses, is the Help to Grow initiative, which is the higher education community working in partnership. And there's been, they've met the target of over 10,000 that they've reached in terms of, that network. And so there is an appetite there. We've also seen an appetite from those small business leaders to actually invest in the apprenticeship programs. So there's been a high level strategic leader program, which has been very popular with some of the apprenticeship transfer funds. So when organisations become aware, maybe through networks and word of mouth, they're actually then really benefiting from these programs, and it's given them an opportunity to actually share best practices, think about innovation and what else they could be doing from people from other sectors. Sometimes it's that community which can really help drive performance and then support their coaching and development.
Sophie, before I move on to my colleague Maria, you wanted to come back at Petra at that point.
Yeah, and I really agree that actually having professional management standards can be really helpful, and the Help to Grow scheme, is really beneficial. But I think for me, one of the things that the Help to Grow scheme doesn't include, which I think is really important for line managers, is this issue about emotional empathy, emotional intelligence, actually being able to have those difficult conversations that actually is more key to the line managerial role. And if line managers aren't getting that right, then a direct report doesn't have anywhere to go, or doesn't feel like they have anywhere to go to discuss things like their wellbeing issues or their performance management. A lot of these courses, and I'm not saying this is the CMI's courses, but a lot of these courses look at the more business approaches to how to manage an organisation, rather than that distinct personal relationship, which I think is really key and fundamental to the line manager position.
Yeah, I mean, I'm involved in the Help to Grow program. You manage in other programs as well, the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Business Program. We're looking very closely at our leadership and management content in response to the issues in your book, and issues which CMI keep representing to us as well, which is great. But we know someone in our Enterprise Research Centre who does research on this with small businesses and with a range of organisations. So, Maria, I'm going to come to you. You've been very patient listening to Petra and Zofia on this. But, you've got into line managers, you picked it up as part of your broader work on workplace mental health and well-being. So what made you get into that particular topic? What was the prompt and trigger? And tell us a little bit more about your research, please, Maria.
Sure, Mark, thanks. So yeah, we've been researching workplace mental health, and that's focused very heavily on line managers and their role since 2020, since before the pandemic. And we've already heard today from both Petra and Zofia about the expectation of line managers to be, for example, all things to all people, the fact that they tend to be squashed in the middle, and it's a very difficult situation often for them. And I would say that is often very, very much amplified in the context of workplace well-being and mental health. And the reason I say that is because mental health and well-being in the workplace in this country and all over the world, in fact, is a significant issue, a significant problem, and it has implications for individuals as well as for firm-level outcomes. So 18.5 million working days lost every year in this country due to mental health sickness. 300,000 people leave their jobs every year in this country because of a mental health issue. And Deloitte tell us that these issues cost businesses in this country, the direct costs are around £56 billion a year. We know that since the pandemic, mental health issues have risen and they have remained at a sustained high level, which means that there's more depression, more anxiety in the workplace. And these are issues that line managers are having to deal with on a daily basis. We also know there's been a particular spike in long-term mental health absences, which again brings its own problems. And one other thing since the pandemic is this sustained increase we see in remote working. And that's another challenge, I think, for line managers, where rather than managing people in the workplace and perhaps being able to pick up on somebody who might be struggling, it's actually much more difficult to notice when somebody's struggling with a mental health issue, when they are often working remotely and they're not in the same room. We also know, touching on training, that from our research, Mark, firms have a very strong tendency to rely on practice-based interventions to deal with workplace mental health issues. And what that essentially means is they are relying on line managers to have conversations with employees to manage these issues in the workplace. And that potentially has big challenges. So in summary, really, mental health issues are on the increase. They're arguably more complex than they used to be. And there's a strong reliance there in firms of all sizes on line managers to deal with these issues. And that's, I guess, why we picked it up at the ERC.
Presumably, you're picking up a lot of information from these line managers. You're talking to them, etc., etc. What sort of support do they need, Maria?
So in order to be effective at dealing with these issues and have open conversations, I think we've already heard this today from Petra and also from Zofia. They need to be observant. They need to be able to pick up on the issues, and they need to be confident communicators. They need to have empathy. We've already heard that word today. They need to be empathetic. They need to be willing to engage with colleagues who might be struggling. And they therefore need to be able to use their skills to create what we call a psychologically safe environment. Because as we know, Mark, mental health issues do attract stigma, and people do feel often very concerned about saying they've got a mental health issue. The other thing that line managers need to do is they need to be willing to role model the right behaviour, because often their subordinates will look up to them to talk about how to behave. Presenteeism, working beyond hours, that sort of thing. And the last thing I would say is, overall, from our research, we see line managers quite often feeling the need to present themselves in a particular way to the people both above and below them in the organisation, and this can provoke quite substantial emotional labour and eventually burnout for these line managers.
I mean, there's clearly not a typical line manager. I mean, you couldn't do a stereotype that they're all shapes and sizes, and some are long in tooth and don't know how to do it. Some are just new to the job and perhaps have that empathy, Maria. It's about a personality thing, it's not just a role itself. Zofia, you want to jump in at that stage as well?
Yeah, of course. So one of the things that I tend to use when talking about the line managers is the AMO model. So I think that line managers have to have the ability to manage. And so that some of that comes back to what Petra was saying about the capability. Do they get the training we don't? Now, obviously, I love the CMI report that about the 82% accidental line managers, because that shows that not enough thought is being put into who is going to be a line manager and the people and organisational abilities that they need to do their role properly. I also think line managers need to have the motivation to want to line manage. Now, somebody might have the ability to line manage, but if they don't have the motivation to line manage, then they still won't do the job properly. And the other thing is, what other organisational resources are needed to help a line manager? So they might have the ability, they might have the motivation, but they might not have the physical capacity or the time to line manage properly. And if they don't have the time to manage properly, that's where things fail as well.
Indeed. Petra, I mean, in terms of the support, you were touching on it earlier in your earlier remarks about what the CMI are doing. I mean, is there anything specific that you would do for small businesses in that sort of, the competencies and that line managers might need?
I mean, I think it is, there's lots of different routes, for them. That, as I say, there's short courses and I think, just actually sort of touching the surface of some of that formal development helps bring them in. So, as referenced earlier by Zofia, it's managing difficult conversations. It's one of the most popular sort of short webinars that we do. It is about managing performance and having those difficult conversations that line managers often really struggle with. And sometimes it's about making time, as you said. It's also, about having the competency and confidence to communicate clearly, what outputs are expected, and also understand, have the empathy for the individual that they're dealing with. So that's a starting point. But as I say, there are lots more formal routes too, which actually also gives people confidence. So although qualifications is not the only way forward, but actually having some formal management training, you find people, in particular, chartered managers that come through are hugely confident that they've actually reflected on their workplace experiences and are really proud of actually being a professional manager. So having that status, which, you'd expect across any other profession. You wouldn't go to an unqualified accountant or you would look for a professional, when dealing with it. Also helps, particularly in the small business environment, in terms of when contracting or actually going out for new business, actually having that professional management, kudos to say, actually, I recognise the value of professional management. And what we do, we do quite a lot of surveys of the management population, and what we do see is a difference in those who are being managed by others. And so 30% who are aware that their line manager had received formal training said that the scores were 87% felt they were supported, 90% felt they were fairly treated, and 91% felt that they could actually be themselves at work. So it all has an effect on stress and well-being in the workplace. Whereas those who thought their managers hadn't been trained, it's down in the 38, 47 and 50s in terms of the reverse responses, in terms of they felt that they couldn't be themselves, they weren't being supported.
And again, thinking about the small business context in terms of, time to go and get that training, whether it's, online webinars or whether it's actually a day course or whatever. Do you think small businesses facing that additional challenge of giving people the space to go and get that training?
I think, it is, yes, if it's something that really matters and makes a difference, then you have to make the time for it. And, big organisations have the same issue there. Right? I'm facing pressures all the time. Yes, there might be more staff sometimes that can, backfill a role if somebody's out of the business for a couple of days, but it is finding the opportunities, which might be, a couple of hours online over a regular period. It's also very much, a lot of really effective training is about reflection. So it's actually thinking about your impact on others, your impact on a project, your impact back in the workplace, and discussing, and having the opportunity to discuss that with others. Clearly, time and money are always those, they're the constraints why people don't do the development. But it's also a missed opportunity. So it's the opportunity cost of not doing it. And, often we, just say, oh, well, I'm too busy at the moment. but it is critical for business performance. So when we look at the return on investment, those that are investing, they've got 23% higher organisational performance. The data itself, in terms of the business outcomes, is quite remarkable. And also you see the impact on stress and illness in the workplace. So the cost of not doing it and not making the time for it, it can easily be outweighed by the outcomes and the return on the investment when you do see effective managers and leaders.
Maria, when you're doing your research on wellbeing, I mean, you shared some statistics earlier with us in terms of the impact of that, not just on the businesses themselves, but on the wider economy, which, again, I mean, you've done a terrific job in bringing those stats to the attention of a whole range of audiences, especially policymakers. I'm thinking in particular about employment law changes coming down the track. Do you think that's, again, another layer of change, if you like, in the workplace that line managers perhaps aren't best suited or having to grapple with? Again, if the things are changing, the employment law's changing, therefore they've got to be careful about the whole range of regulatory issues that they're going to have to pay attention to. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, Mark. We know, again, in the context of wellbeing, we know from talking to line managers that they're very worried about doing and saying the right thing, and particularly worried about doing and saying the wrong thing. And clearly that comes down to whether they are up to date on what they are able to say in the context of, of any situation in the workplace, frankly. But when it comes to our research, it's focused very much on people with mental health issues. They're very concerned that they are doing the right thing and that they are seen to be doing the right thing. If they feel, and they often do feel, unsupported by their organisations in, for example, not having training to deal with these issues, if they feel that there isn't anybody that they can go and speak to who can help them to make sure that they do the right thing, then that can be very, very challenging for them. When it comes to, for example, having those open conversations, which we've heard about in the workplace, 90% of firms, or even more than 90% of firms, encourage open conversations with employees, between employees and their line managers, but only 60% of firms provide training for line managers in having these difficult conversations. That is of itself a huge problem for line managers who on a daily basis are required to be, as we've already heard, all things to all people, but don't always know what it is they can and can't say, what they should and shouldn't say.
Okay, thanks for that, Maria. Zofia, I can see you want to come back on that point.
Yeah, I think what's concerning in a lot of these situations now is the plethora of evidence that is growing to show that the well-being of the manager itself can have an impact on those whom they manage. And so if organisations are putting all this pressure on line managers to get this right, then the well-being of the manager is in itself going to be compromised. Now, the line manager has often been noted as to be one of the most stressful positions in an organisation. Yet if they are so critical in getting business operations right, well-being right, engagement right, then I think that more support needs to be invested on making sure that line manager well-being is also managed correctly. Now, I remember interviewing a line manager who said, I'd go to bed not only with the thoughts and concerns about my own position, but the thoughts and concerns of the 8 people that I manage. Now, is that really the pressure that organisations want line managers to be feeling? And so I think, if there's going to be continued pressure and continued, I suppose that the continued enlargement of the line managerial role, and if there isn't going to be a better look at what we're really asking our line managers to do, what is their role and what is their capacity to do their role, then organisations really have to start thinking about how they look after their line managers themselves, if line managers are that missing piece of the productivity puzzle, which they're often seemingly described as being.
Okay, thanks for that, Zofia. We're coming to the end of our time, but I'm just keen to give each of you a final comment on this topic, which, it's something which we know is important. We've heard that it's important, but it's not often talked about in the sort of higher policy circles of, developing solutions to productivity. The Productivity Institute themselves have been looking at work of the functional areas of the business and the organization and how they can actually, be part of the line management solution, as well as creating a lot of problems in their own right. But I think in the small business world, I still see the wall between the owner manager, the CEO, the founder, and the line management role as being quite blurred. So again, what with that blurred relationship, how can we actually begin to think of the sort of solutions to get the owner founder out of the business to do the training, to build the competencies, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's, for me, is the major conundrum that I can see in terms of the small business world. But any final thoughts on that from each of you? Petra, I'll come to you first.
I think it is about investment, and I think the first bit is come back to Zofia's point. It's about individuals also investing in themselves and protecting themselves. The first core part of management competencies is managing self. And as you say, if they're going to be a role model, if they're going to be leading and supporting others in their teams, they actually need to think about their own well-being and their own investment in skills. But then it's also, in parallel to that, it's about the organisation level of investment and organisations really understanding the critical importance of those management and leadership skills at all levels, and actually then investing appropriately to ensure that they are supported. And as I say, there is a lot of support out there. But it is investing both the time and resource and prioritising that if they really want that productivity gain and sort of that long-term sustainability. And I think, you talked about the Employment Rights Bill. That's is a challenge. I think there's a lot of new challenges coming down the line, particularly with AI, sustainability, multi-generational workplaces, keeping the inclusion in terms of, there's a lot of economically inactive that we need to get back into the workplace, which needs even more line management skills and support. So there's a lot of challenges out there. So I think it is time, for businesses and individuals that can to make those investments, because I don't think we'll see a lot coming from the government in terms of very straitened economic times and public sector spending. So I think it's back to employers really to really step up.
We've talked about workplace well-being, but I think the nature of the workplace itself is changing, which we would all agree with. Zofia, let me come to you for a final word on this topic today.
I think it's about recognition. I think it's about recognising the role and what a line manager has to do, and actually trying to define what the core competencies we want of the role. I think we're talking about it at an organisational level. The 82% of accidental line managers is an absolutely shocking statistic. Now, if this role is so important, why aren't we developing a line management talent pipeline? We invest in skills, we invest in technical competencies, but the line management pipeline is something that has completely been ignored. And I do think there also is a policy implication here as well. We've got the Get Britain Working policy paper out at the moment and the Keep Britain Working consultation happening. Now, we want people to go into good work and to be rewarded well at work and to experience good work. Now, a lot of that comes down to their relationship with the line manager. So what are policymakers doing to recognise the role of the line manager in this scenario? There's very little out there about what the role of policy is doing to support this fundamental role. So there needs to be recognition both at an organisational level about what you're asking line managers to do, but also at a policy level as to what support are we giving organisations to understand and recognise the fundamental nature of this role.
Thank you, Zofia. And a final word from Maria, please.
Yeah, I agree with both what both my colleagues have said. But I would also focus here on the place that the line manager finds themselves, which is squashed in the middle, and the emotional labour that this provokes. And I would say that instead of treating emotional labour as a given for line managers, we need to have a think about why this burden is placed on line managers. And what organisations can do to change this. So I definitely agree that there is a role for training here to help line managers feel more confident managing these difficult issues and stress management and so on, and leadership training. But I think we also need to have a think about the broader structural issues here, perhaps related to workload, expectations, workflow, and how we can help managers to be more autonomous, to have manageable workloads, to be clear with the expectations that we have for them, and making sure that they have opportunities for social support to help them to deal with what can be a really challenging, but obviously a very critical role in the workplace.
Okay, thanks very much, Maria. We've come out of time, I'm afraid. We could go on for a lot longer exploring all of these issues. And indeed, all three of you have built careers and continue to build careers on this topic. So well done to the three of you. I think if you want to find out more about the individuals who've contributed to the podcast, Petra, you'll be found at CMI, Zofia at the Institute of Employment Studies, and Maria, I think you'll be found at through ERC into your new venture. But we will keep in contact with these individuals, an important topic indeed. So thanks formally to the three of you for today. And thanks to all of you who've been listening to the podcast. If you've enjoyed it and you want to find out more about the work of the Enterprise Research Centre, we do have a website, www.enterpriseresearch.ac.uk.